Hello and welcome to Thinking Out Loud. My name is Steve Donaldson and I'm your host and moderator for this evening. This is the third in our ongoing series of philosophical dialogues with everyday people. And our topic tonight is free will an illusion? So let's go ahead and get the ball rolling as we usually do by having our guests introduce themselves and getting a first reaction, so one line, short gut reaction to the question. And we'll start on my far left here with Mike.
Hi, my name is Mike Grosso, and with the rest of the human race, I do believe in the reality of free will. On the other hand, it's very easy to be deceived. There are times when I might not be as free as I think I am.
My name is Carol, and I believe I would feel very hopeless if I did not believe in some free will.
Hi, I'm Steve Semenik, and I have mixed feelings on the free will question. I do believe that there are times we can alter things in our lives, but a lot of times we're just going with the flow.
I'm John Titus, and I'm fascinated by the question of free will. It's one that people have been considering for thousands of years, and I'm looking forward to discussing it.
My name is Jerry Hummel. I believe that there's room for both for free will and what you might call fate or divine will. They're in a complex and subtle relationship with each other.
My name's Jeff Johnson, and I thought I had a quick yes or no answer to that, but it seems the great comedians in the sky have tied my tongue, so no comment, but odds are, and Las Vegas, listen up, the odds are good that I'll have something to say later on.
Zeke Hanchak. I think unpredictable individual actions are indisputable, but I'm also interested in what predisposes us to assume that there are illusory items of human experience.
I'm Bob Miller. I'm convinced that there's a lot of illusions, such as for a long time people thought that the sun revolved around the earth, and it certainly seems that way. But that free will is also an illusion, and that's actually a very good thing when you really deeply consider it.
Well, if there's no free will, I want to know what it costs. My name's Dave Root.
My name is Ken Thompson, and you heard it here last. It's all an illusion.
Okay, well, thanks. And we'll now just open it up. I'll start on this side. Mike, you go ahead.
Well, I'll just say a few words to try to frame the problem as I understand it. First of all, I think that most of us at a naive, everyday level believe that we do have the ability to choose freely. And what that means, it seems to me, is that there's a real option. That's how I would define a free act, that the act is optional. Obviously, not all our acts are optional. I can't fly to the moon, but I can think about flying to the moon. That's up to me. But I cannot actually just fly to the moon. Well, anyway, so that's the intuitive feeling that I think most of us have pre-reflectively. On the other hand, science, the rise of modern science, tells us that everything in nature is determined by strict laws of necessity. Even at the quantum level, there is determinism. So there seems to be a conflict, on the one hand, with what science tells us about what we are and who we are and how we work, and on the other hand, our intuitive sense that we are free in some limited but significant ways. So out of that conflict arises the problem. And so let's just take it from there. At least for me, that would be the point of departure of the discussion, but I'll turn it over to you.
Okay.
Pick it up from here.
Bob, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up science. There's a lot of things that appear to be one way, and I trust logic and evidence more than I trust the way things appear to be to me.
Okay. Gary?
Okay.
I was kind of thinking about a point that I think Mike was kind of making, that when you're talking about flying to the moon in your head, I think there's a lot of options, a lot of freedom that you can express internally in your imagination. I think we always have a potential for freedom if maybe even our actual acts are not possible in some ways.
Okay, David.
Well, I think to paraphrase Descartes, when he said, I think, therefore I am. I think if that proposition is true, and if I am, then I'm a force in nature. And if I'm a force in nature, then I change nature as I act, as I think and I act. And therefore, free will exists. Whether it's an illusion or not is how we interpret it. If we have a belief system that says the stars guide us, then we are restricted by our beliefs. If we have a belief in ourselves as a force in the universe, we have freedom.
So what would your definition of free will be, as sort of as distinct as possible? What is it?
I would think that the opposite of free will would be determinism, destiny, fate, that God's plan. I don't think we can talk about free will without some discussion of the metaphysical, the existence of God, the existence of some force in the universe that guides us and has some sort of plan. I personally don't see that, but I do see that we are all restricted by what we believe.
Mm-hmm. Okay. John?
Well, I think the question of free will may be based on a questionable assumption that human beings are divided into two parts, a physical, natural part, and a supernatural part, which is the center of our freedom. And that the question of free will kind of devolved to the nature of the supernatural part.
Absolutely.
Now, in other traditions, like Eastern traditions, like India and the Buddhist countries, they are more strictly relativistic. Everything is related to everything else. And the question, and we are all parts of a single big whole, and the question of free will doesn't seem to arise in those traditions.
So, John, in that tradition, one of those traditions, which two of the parts would they be more? I mean, are they like all metaphysical or all physical, or if you can put it that way?
Yeah, in our tradition, we tend to feel that some things are sacred and some things are not, or profane. In their tradition, everything is sacred.
Everything is on the sacred side. Zeke's next.
The last two comments, I'm questioning if one does not subscribe to a doctrine or an ethos or any system, does free will and the potentials of free will action become more abundant?
I didn't quite follow that. Expand on that a little bit more.
It seems to be that there's a limitation factor going on by plugging into a system.
Mm-hmm. A system like a belief system.
Yes.
Like the heavens, as Jeff was referring to, tied my tongue.
Any sort of overriding worldview.
Okay.
It would seem to me that if one subscribes not, freedom is maximized.
So, if one doesn't believe that there is determinism, then there's not determinism? Is that what you're saying? It sounds a little tricky to me. Well,
it never occurred to me.
Okay. Mike's next.
There is a version of that argument I'll quickly rehearse, and it's William James' pragmatic argument for free will. He said it's more useful to believe that you have free will, because if you believe that you have free will, you're more likely to make efforts to do things that you would otherwise not do. So there's a version there of that pragmatic, to believe, just by virtue of believing that I am free, I may influence my behavior and do things that if I believed in determinism, I would just lie back passively and let fate kick me around like a football. So, however, what I wanted to say was in response to John, I do think it's an error, John, to state or to claim that the belief in free will entails the belief in the supernatural. If we have this property, and the property lies in our certain actions that we perform, not all of them, it's simply a part of our natural endowment as human beings. I think that misleads us to make that claim. I mean, I'm not a supernaturalist. I'm not a believer, but I'm in the supernatural. But I do believe in free will. Now, one question I'd like to throw out that might help us see what's at stake if we deny free will. There's a conceptual cost that's considerable. Most of us, I think, would make a distinction between acts, well, for example, the blameworthy actions of Adolf Hitler and the praiseworthy actions of Mother Teresa, right? We assume that human beings are responsible for their actions, not all the time, but that's part of our understanding of human behavior and the moral universe that we inhabit. Now, my question to those who reject the belief in free will is, are you also willing to say that there is no moral difference between the lives of, let's say, an Adolf Hitler and a Mother Teresa? What happens to all of those distinctions that we normally assume, that the law assumes, that our whole civilization assumes, that we assume in trying to shape and mold our children, for example, or in dealing with other human beings? We have an ever-present sense that people are more or less responsible morally for their actions. If you are a strict determinist, you have to throw that distinction out the window. It turns everything, in some serious ways, quite topsy-turvy. One reason I would hesitate to commit myself to complete determinism.
Okay. Ken?
To say nothing of the Protestant Reformation. I'm glad Zeke brought up the belief systems, because I think the limitation that you'd find there is not in the universe. The limitation is in the believer. We have the very good fortune to be inhabiting a universe that contains all possibilities simultaneously. And so we've got predeterminism going on with energetic interactions all the time, and we have the capacity to change our course, to do something differently, to act according to our own whim simultaneously. Very much like a boat riding on the surface of the ocean can steer in any direction it wants and create all kinds of wakes, and yet it doesn't disturb the basic determined tidal motions, or the fact that there is an ocean to start with, or the orbit of the Earth around the sun. So I'm arguing that both coexist simultaneously.
Okay. Steve?
Getting back to the moral question that Mike brought up, when you look at where free will started to really become a major factor, I think, in Western civilization, was with the rise of monotheism and with the idea of a duality, good and evil, and a good deity and an evil deity, or what have you, in opposition. And at that point, it became important to give the human being a place in the matter, because then you can take a side. Now, if you look at human behavior as more or less a force of nature, like you would, say, a tiger or a shark, we don't view a tiger or a shark as evil. They are a force of nature. They do what they do because it is their nature to do it. One would avoid a tiger, perhaps, kill a tiger if it was invading your village, but you wouldn't necessarily say the tiger was evil. Bad, perhaps. And therefore, you could do the same thing with human beings. If this person's nature is to be violent or belligerent, well, one might avoid him or her, or one might need to defend oneself up to the point of killing that individual, but they would just be like any other force of nature.
Well, Steve, now, would that be the whole story for humans as far as you're concerned? Or when I get back to what John was talking about, breaking the human being as a phenomenon into two parts, maybe not natural and supernatural, but maybe, let's say, material and non-material would be a better distinction, both of which are natural. But you can envision the material as being just a complex robot, a biological robot of some sort, and the tiger is just a stimulus response doing what a tiger does. Would you go so far as to say humans are also just biological robots in that sense, or is there another part?
Well, I personally wouldn't go that route, but one could easily make that case. It really comes down to, do we consider ourselves so far apart from the rest of the animal kingdom that we claim to be something entirely unique and different, or are we merely just an animal with a larger brain and a greater sense of self-awareness?
Good question. All right, Bob.
Oh boy, I just want to respond to everything. I think the morality question, this idea of humans as some sort of free moral agents leads to the whole idea of blame, and stops at looking, if we just label Hitler as evil, well then that sort of can become this explanation. Why did Hitler do what he did? Well, he was evil. And when it stops there, then we stop looking at what's the context, what are the influences on somebody like Hitler. And without free will, we need to start looking at influences. John, you said something about free will being, I believe, supernatural, or somebody implied at least that it was supernatural. And I absolutely agree. Supernatural being something that is outside of the natural universe of cause and effect, this absolute interdependence. And the Buddhists, if you talk, of course there's a million kinds of Buddhists, and some Buddhists believe if you chant to a little paper scroll you get color TVs or something. There's a million kinds of Buddhists, but Zen Buddhism and some of the more fundamental types, some of the more fundamental, not in the sense of having dogma like I think you're talking about when you talk about belief systems, believe that absolutely we are just like the tiger or the earthquake or the thunderstorm or anything else that could be labeled a force of nature, are absolutely part of the entire independence of it, and that that's ultimate freedom, and that there is no need to believe that I'm a freely willing agent. I absolutely am convinced that's not true, and yet to me that's ultimate freedom and provides tremendous comfort, not distress whatsoever. And to think of a tiger as being a robot, look at squirrels playing. Do they look like robots? They look like they're having fun to me. And birds playing in the sky, but most people don't ascribe free will to these kind of animals. In fact, most people ascribe free will to two things, humans and God. I call them big God and little God. Right? We and God share the same attribute of being able to make decisions free of influences. Logic and evidence would indicate otherwise, and that when we get away from the blame and the shame and justifying retribution, that we are actually a lot freer. And when we can accept that, well, at this time things can't be any other way than the way they are. There's a lot of freedom there. What are the options that I can see right now?
So let me see if I understand this correctly. It sounds like you're saying that by accepting free will as an illusion, that is, that there is no free will, that's how you become most free. It sounds almost like a contradiction. You become most free by accepting that there is no free will. Is that what I understood you to say?
Yeah, and I don't even know if I can explain that. All I can say is that that's what the experience is for this organism. And that's what, if you speak to Zen Buddhists or who also would see the world the same way, as entirely interdependent, that everything is part of the matrix, the natural matrix of cause and effect, and that there is this sense of lightness there.
What it reminds me of is, in a sense, not my will be done, but thine. And thine could be the natural order of things, or Taoism, or God, or whatever you want to call it.
I would love to do a study of people who have turned their lives over to God. In fact, I did a Google search once on people who've turned their lives over to God and studied them. And some of them were fairly flaky, but so many of them were just described as such freedom. Such freedom. And what does that mean to them? What do they perceive as God's guidance or as God's will? But and they talk about a sense of freedom and lightness as well.
Okay. Carol.
I guess I want to bring it down to a more simplistic level. And as I look around here tonight, how did we all get here? Did we come here with freedom of will? Was it determined? I mean, I know that I made the decision to come here. Yes, the option was I could come or I couldn't come.
What made you want to come versus not come? What were the influences on you that would influence you to partake of something like this instead of staying home and watch television? If you start asking, well, why did I decide this? You might
Well,
find
there's always
chain of influences.
don't you believe there's a multitude of reasons? Because
Absolutely.
until you
and free
reach,
will is not one of them. That's what I'm
but freedom of will, after you have all of the options, then you can make the decision, and your decision is based on free will.
Okay, let's let David come in.
I came tonight because Steve asked me. I think we have to remember that the concept free will is based on language, and language which was developed by human beings. And the reason that we don't attribute free will to other animals is not because they're lower animals, but because they didn't think of it. And I think that outside of, and we talked about predeterminism, fatalism, the master plan, that's one limitation of free will, but there are other limitations of free will, and that is our biological dynamics. I mean, we are all walking chemical labs of hormones and genetics of chromosomes of things implanted in our unconscious that we have no control over. So to an extent, our free will is really somehow mitigated by our biology. But nonetheless, I think that when we think, when we act in the world, our free will is demonstrated. And whether we do it as a result of coercion or cajoling or inducement or whatever, I think we are acting and we're making choices. And when you make a choice, you demonstrate free will.
Mm-hmm. I'm wondering if free will then might be not something that's absolute, but rather a matter of degree. And I'm even thinking that animals might have a certain degree of ability to make choices. I know when I've seen my cat, for instance, look like he's deciding between running out the door or having dinner, because the door is open but he hasn't eaten yet, and he'll look one way, then he'll look the other. And so is making a decision, is that synonymous with exercising free will?
Well, when you talk about the biology influence on free will, I think instinct is part of that.
Mm-hmm.
What do our instincts drive us to do? And can we recognize our influence of instinct? And can we change our will based on our understanding of our own drives? And that's the difference between us and your cat. Mm-hmm. Your cat acts upon instinct without reflection, at least as far as we know, without reflection or deliberation. It acts based on what it wants or needs at that moment. Mm-hmm. We, on the other hand, are driven by impulses, by influences, and have the ability to reflect and deliberate and enforce and demonstrate our free will in many ways that I think other animals don't.
Okay. John?
Well, my experience is that decisions sort of make themselves in my mind, and I think the problem over for a while, and try to take everything into account, and then after a while the decision makes itself and bubbles to the surface, makes itself somewhere where I can't see it, and it bubbles to the surface, and then I have to decide how to carry it out. So if there's free will going on, it's a kind of free will that's taking place below my consciousness.
Mm-hmm. But
also, I've noticed that sometimes you have the greatest experience of freedom when you're in the grip of some kind of a creative role, when you're on some creative role, like when you're improvising in jazz, doing a jazz improvisation. I think that's, and you're not thinking of things consciously, you're just letting it come through you. You have the feeling of something working through you, not of something you're doing yourself. And that's the greatest experience of freedom I know of.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Jeff?
was going to say that I think psychology has a grip on philosophy these days, and there's something to do with, representing a human as being worth, 62 cents in terms of chemical compound. We focus on the lower, the appetites, things like that, and of course we're determined. Do we decide whether we want to have sex or eat when we're hungry? Of course not. Our culture seems to be kind of, especially academic culture, seems to be focused around the individual drives and things, and not the higher things, not creative genius. Or we no longer study. I mean, kids these days, they don't have heroes, like great heroes, who've made great moral decisions that affected millions and millions of people. So there seems a kind of a bias in that towards, we're all determined, so we'll just suck it up.
So when we're acting in the sort of the lower realm, you're saying that might very well be determined, and therefore people who are sort of living there are not exercising free will. Or you're saying that we only exercise free will if we get up to the higher, aspirations or something?
I suppose the carrot dangling there in front of every human being is to, towards that enlightenment goal, whether Buddha or Western philosophy, to, know thyself or to learn how to die well or whatever.
Now, interesting.
So I think certain people are much freer than other people.
Now,
practically speaking,
a couple of times it was raised this notion that those who have gone far along this journey often report a kind of surrender or giving over a will or to find even greater freedom by being more of a conduit or. So I'm wondering if maybe free will is sort of a phase that's not the base robot, but a process that you go through on your way to this place, ironically, where you no longer have free will.
Ideally, you get to a point where your free will, you think to a certain point, and then you no longer have free will. You will not do certain things. You will do certain things if provoked in a certain way or whatever, stimulated in a certain way. And the flip side, too, I was going to say about belief systems is that you could surrender yourself to God, Buddha, whatever. Well, history, look at history. People who do that are basically become leaf in the wind of tyrannies. I give myself to God, okay, then I let someone else rule me. And
well, what about Mother?
That's all I have to say.
How about Mother Teresa? Would that be?
Mother Teresa.
Where does she fit in that?
Mother Teresa is a case of somebody heavily entrenched in Catholic dogma in the situation of Dhaka, Bangladesh, or wherever it was. What's the capital city? Calcutta. Who, because of that dogma, says in a place like Calcutta, no birth control, no abortions. So that's so you decide whether that's good or bad.
Oh, okay. Well, I'll leave it at that and turn it over to Steve.
I want to draw a distinction between free will and freedom to choose or free choice.
Okay.
They're two different things in my book. Freedom of choice is, do I get chocolate or vanilla? Or do I get the ice cream or not get the ice cream? Do I buy a Lincoln or a Ford? They're minor by comparison. And very often, they don't include the entire spectrum of what our choices be. Are you a Republican or a Democrat? Well, what about all those other minor parties? Or, for instance, just as a... Now, free will, to me, will is a bigger thing. It should almost be capitalized or italicized, bold. That involves, first of all, knowing who you are, what you are, and what you really desire. That takes work. It's not something I believe anyone is really born with, because there are so many other distractions thrown in our way during the process of growing up. Part of our culture, our family, our religion, whatever background we come from, whatever psychological blocks have been thrown in our way during the course of maturation, etc. And the only way we can approach free will is to dig into ourselves, find out what we really are, what is the essential me, and how do I express that? And I believe that the process of discovering that essential me and expressing that is almost identical to what some people would call surrendering to God or being in the Tao or the flow. Because it gets away, it strips away the illusions, it strips away all of the blinders and puts you down into a position of having to face the truth and then live with the truth. And once you no longer have to lie to yourself or anybody else, you are free. And you can be who you are. Now, that can scare the living bejesus out of a lot of people, because who you are might not be someone who fits well within the social milieu you're living in.
Okay, now, do you think there are degrees of, certainly, you don't necessarily know yourself completely at one given moment. You might get to know yourself better over time. As you do, how does that affect free will? Are you getting more and more free will? And what does it mean when at one time you thought you were exercising free will, and then sometime in the future you look back with a little bit more self-knowledge and say, oh, I thought I was exercising free will, but now I see I was really under the influence of something or other, something or other. Is it progressive that way, or is it sort of an all or nothing thing, do you think?
Well, we do grow and we do progress. I think that there comes as like a threshold experience perhaps in someone's life when suddenly there's that aha. And you may not be able to hold on to it forever. You may be in that place of, wow, here I am with the flow for a few hours and then lose it. But now that you know it exists, you can aim towards getting back there.
Good. Ken?
Yes, I want to revisit this notion of belief systems. I don't think it's necessary to bring a God of any sort or a higher power into this discussion in order to resolve it. Essentially, belief systems, you're just giving up your power to some other agency. But we do have to talk about the law of karma. And in the West, we don't talk about karma much. But we do have this thing called consequences, as you all know, having gone through public school system. So if you decide to turn left or turn right, each of those choices has consequences. And the consequences simply are the result of all the energy that's already in motion in the universe. So you have to deal with those consequences. In the East, they call that karma. That's the whatever action you take, there is other actions upon you as a result of that. So to me, this illustrates right away that yes, you have the free will to make your choice, and yes, there are predetermined energies already at play in the universe that will supply the consequences for each of those choices that you do make.
Okay. What I'm curious to get a hold of now is a kind of a definition of free will, as opposed to, I know there are consequences, but there are also consequences to a computer program. And we sort of touched on it at one point. I can't remember who was talking about, well, making the distinction between animals and whether it's a conscious choice as opposed to an unconscious choice. What part does consciousness or awareness enter into this concept of free will? How would you define free will? Anybody? Well, Mike. Okay.
I did start off by saying, I gave a definition, I think, which is crucial, and that is that the free will entails optional actions,
okay,
so that there's alternatives are really possible. That's what we mean by it, right? I mean, and that's why, in other words, I was free to commit murder, or I was not free to commit murder. If I commit murder, I'm responsible for my action, and there's that notion of blame that attaches to my action, at least in the way we function as normal human beings. But what I wanted, so anyway, that would, to my mind, is crucial. But I did want to get back to a couple of points here. One, the talk about surrendering to a higher being does not in any way, as you suggested, it seems to me at any rate, Bill, right? Bob, sorry. That is a good example to illustrate the virtues of determinism, because a person who surrenders to a higher being chooses to do so and has to sustain that choice on a daily basis. We're not machines. You get up in the morning and you're automatically in that mode. If someone decides to surrender their will to a higher will, that in itself is a choice. Just as sometimes people do not act when they, in fact, are free to act, they choose not to act. Sartre called that bad faith. But I wanted also to say something about the role of influence and interdependence, which you point. I absolutely agree that we are being influenced all of the time by all sorts of things. And we're also interdependent on one another and on nature and so on. But that in no way works against the belief in free will. First of all, no one is claiming that our freedom is absolute. That was another point that I think we started off with. It's finite. But that finite freedom, I believe, is very important. So let me just illustrate with the case of influence. I'm sure we've all had the experience, let's say, of getting angry and being tempted to do something that we knew at that moment would be wrong. I've had this experience many times. What happens? Well, sometimes we yield, and when we yield, we choose to do the act. But we also have the ability to resist our inclinations. I may be hungry, but for one reason or another, I will resist eating at that moment. I may be angry, but I will struggle to contain my anger because I think that's the better thing to do. What sense can we make out of the conflicts, the inner conflicts that we experience, unless, in fact, there was some kind of struggle to deal with options? The influences are there, but we resist the influences. It may simply be, I may be forced up against the firing squad. And yes, there's an influence, and there's a power, and I'm about to be executed. But I can still, at that moment, facing the firing squad, adopt a point of view. I can still say something. I can defy my executioner, or I can crawl on my knees and beg, but I'm free. Even if it's only to speak or to think at that moment, I'm free. Whenever I look into myself, I always find that element of freedom, no matter what the circumstances and the influences are, as long as I'm a functioning human being. And I don't see how you can deny those aspects of common human experience. But if you subscribe to a doctrine of determinism, you are forced to dump out of the window all kinds of experiences that are quite normal. For example, what sense would it make to talk about regret? Have any of you ever had a regret over something? I have lots of regrets. The implication is that I might have done otherwise. So if we look closely at our own ordinary, doesn't have to be cosmic, everyday inner activities, the evidence for free optional actions, whether they be inner or outer actions, is omnipresent, at least to my inner perception.
Okay. David?
Yeah, I think the concept of, well, one who believes in determinism, it would not affect their behavior necessarily, but it would affect their perception of themselves as a free being. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's the distinction between one who accepts determinism and one who does not. I think the classic story of this is in Genesis, the story of Adam and Eve and the serpent and the forbidden fruit. I mean, here's a situation where two people are living a great life. All they have to do is, not eat this fruit. But they're given that ability to make a choice. And it's the choice that they make that ultimately determines the course of humankind. So the myth goes. and we are in the process, or we have been struggling to get back to that point of paradise, to undo that choice, which we all know cannot be done, but we still keep trying. I think when you say, Steve, can we define what free will is? I think of the human being that has the most obvious will, which is a teenager, and who's the most lacking in free will, because they don't understand all of the influences that guide them, that guide them to make choices that are not in their best interest, whether it's peer pressure or hormones or whatever. And I think that we're all sort of in that condition to a degree, that we exert our, we demonstrate our free will by choices. Choices are not free will, but they illustrate our free will. And whether it's a choice of whether to have scrambled eggs or cereal, or whether it's a choice of to believe in God or not, they're all choices. And every choice that we make demonstrates that we are human beings with the ability to choose and to have free will.
Well, I want to see if I can sort of collect a few thoughts here, because we're circling around something, but I'm not sure we're quite there yet. If, as a definition for free will, we're taking the ability to make decisions or simply making decisions, then we have to say free will exists because we all make decisions. It gets a little bit more complicated if you say, but it has to be a decision made freely. And then we have to wonder what that means. Well, free of influences, or then it becomes a matter of degree. So I'm wondering if, that's why I'm trying to grab onto a definition of free will now. Mike, you're talking about, called it not an action so much as an ability, which I always found interesting. It's the ability to exercise an option. And so it's sort of like a potential. I'm wondering if free will is necessarily incompatible with determinism. Because if free will is an internal state, but determinism actually determines outcome, whether they can both coexist.
Well, I'd like to
go ahead, David.
That. Dostoevsky said through one of his characters in The Brothers Karamazov that if given a choice, most men, meaning humans, I think, would choose peace and contentment over freedom. And I think that we're all faced with that choice, whether to go the hard road and make choices and suffer the consequences, or to give up our free choice and be passive, be content, stay at status quo. And I think it's something that we all need to guard against. I mean, do we really want free will? Do we really want freedom? And are we willing to pay the price for it?
Okay. John.
Well, free will in the West is part of a belief system that includes things like blame and responsibility and moral choices. And it's a very complete, thoroughly worked out belief system with a lot of internal consistency. But that doesn't mean that it's the whole answer. Because there are lots of other belief systems like that too. That, for example, the belief that years ago that the Earth was flat. That made a lot of sense until more was discovered. And the same thing may be happening with this belief system too. Now, in the West, we tend to think that our center of free will is in our ego, that we possess it in the same way as we possess anything else that we possess. We identify it with ourselves. But in the East, in the Eastern tradition, the feeling is that the free will comes through you, not from you. That it's an effective, some kind of freedom that's working its way through you. That's not coming from your ego, from yourself. And the object of religious practice in the East, at any rate, is to clear obstacles out out of the way so that that freedom can come through, even to the point of clearing away your ego. And in the West, however, we emphasize ego, we cultivate it.
Good point. All right.
Yeah, well said. And it kind of goes along with what you were talking about earlier. I believe when you said the ultimate freedom is, say, when you're improvising in jazz, it's not a pre-considered sort of thing. There's a state called flow that a lot of people have. And when they're fully engaged in something like downhill skiing or driving cars, a lot of people get it, where it feels like ultimate freedom, but it's not that I'm thinking about what I'm going to do next. It's flowing through you, as you say. I would ask Mike, and Mike, I think you brought up a point that's probably where a lot of people have the same kind of question and reaction that you do. That, okay, sometimes this feeling of anger comes up, and then also what comes up is, wait a minute, there's an option here. One option is to just be carried away with this anger and then do things that I might later on say, ooh, that didn't turn out well. I would sure prefer not to do that again. And another option is when I realize I have an option, then, well, maybe I can do something else, not follow through on this anger. And I would ask you, what influences you? Why does this option occur to you when it might not occur to somebody else? Why does that happen? What would that maybe be the result of influences? And John, when you talked about how a lot of times these things, they appear in consciousness, I would challenge people to stop and for just 1 minute, don't think any thoughts. If you're the thinker of your thoughts, don't think any thoughts. And what you'll find is thoughts are coming up. So where's this freely willing agent?
Okay.
Did ask me a question.
Right. Well, because of the format, we need to let Carol get in here, and we'll get back.
I'm not sure where I'm going with this, but it came to mind as everyone was talking about the book, Man in Search of Self. And I don't recall the author, but he was in a concentration camp, and he was, Man in Search of, okay, but he was stripped of everything, his dignity, his family, his possessions, but yet he maintained a determinism to stay alive and to go forward. And his belief system also made him make a choice. So, yes, there was a determinism, and the choice was to go forward. So, was that, I'm trying to pull this together, it was free will to do so. So is free will a combination of determinism and choice and bringing it together? I mean, we can have both. Why can't we have both?
Well, that's what I'm thinking, and I'm wondering, and I'm just going to throw this out, whether one could look at determinism as affecting outcome and free will being an experience, a personal experience. And in that regard, I don't think that they're necessarily mutually exclusive. Jeff, why don't you take a turn here?
I was going to say just maybe some homework for the viewers and us. But Boethius, in The Consolation of Philosophy, he argued that it's all causal, everything's causal. But within that causality, we have free will.
Can you explain that?
I explained it in 20 pages about 15 years ago in an essay. I don't remember exactly the reasoning, but it is sort of paradoxical. So maybe that's the answer, paradox.
So what you're saying, according to this line of thinking, that everything is cause and effect.
This is like 14th century.
Okay, there's cause and effect. And then within that context, there is free will.
Yeah, wrap your head around it.
Well, one way it comes to my mind is that if you always choose what's determined, then
sort of, right. Yeah,
you're exercising your free will to choose.
What he was talking about.
Yeah.
It reminds me. Another
okay,
quick
yeah,
thing.
go ahead.
I think if we look, I was talking about psychology versus philosophy. If we look back on our lives, we look back sort of objectively, or we're supposed to be doing that, and that's what psychology does. Influences, obvious influences. You can't look back on your life subjectively, objectively. And that's the problem. You look forward to your life. You look forward to decisions subjectively. Like, I can do this and I can do that. But you can't do it going backwards. So when we look at historical figures, the unfolding history of the world, we go, okay, this, because of this, because of this, because of this. It's obvious. That's history. And that's actually that's partly why historical knowledge is sort of boring now. Because we don't focus on the personalities, because that's not in vogue anymore. It used to be in vogue. People used to study the personalities and those moral decisions, Plutarch and the great heroes and all that.
Yeah, that's good. Okay. Steve.
I'm going to offer a potential definition of free will.
Right.
I would say that free will is the ability to act outside of the realm of predictability. And that if I can predict what you're going to do, you're really not free.
Now,
you're doing something according to some pattern that's like a program. Now, again, I'm not, there's going to be a matter of degree on this, but I mean, even if someone's like in a concentration camp, I'm going to predict, well, this person's going to buckle down and try to survive, or they're going to give up and die. If they do something completely different outside of that realm, then hey, that's really going to surprise me. If they start a revolution in the camp or overthrow the guards or something like that, I mean, one of the other two, that's usually there's a polarization in the way human energies work anyway. Someone will go in one direction, someone will go in another. To get outside of the box, that's really what I would look at as being free will. Now, again, talking about the determinism and free will coexisting. Well, if you look at, say, for instance, the Vikings believed their fate was cast by the Norns. They were three mythical goddess sisters who wove the skein of destiny for each human being who lived on the planet. So they believed, for instance, if they were going into battle, it was already predetermined before they picked up their sword and their shield whether they would live or die in that battle. So now the only choice they had was, am I going to act courageously or am I going to act cowardly? It doesn't matter what I do as to whether I will live or die, but only how I will live or die. And that was their choice.
Interesting. All right. Zeke.
There seems to be an accumulating weight of evidence, at least in our discussion, even if by degrees, that free will does exist. But I'd like to approach the question from the backside, which is, the original question was, is free will an illusion?
Right.
And so I'd like to know by what means or measures any individual or group of people would, after all the ways to respond, avoid or approach pains and pleasures in their multiplicities, by what means or measures would we be caused to say that we had had an unreal experience, an illusory experience, an illusion? What would cause us to make that determination?
Well, I think I sort of hinted at that at one point, and let's see if we can elaborate on that. The idea that looking back on your life, in the moment you might have thought that, oh, this is what I really want to do. Well, I'll take an example from my own life. I really want to become a doctor. That's what I'm going to go to medical school and be a doctor. I get there, as Steve was saying, I learn a little bit more about myself, I realize, I don't want to be a doctor. And then I start looking back, well, what influences there were and maybe how I came to think that I wanted to be a doctor. Now, would that be an example of, oh, that was an illusion back then when I thought I was exercising my free will?
No, I don't believe that's the quality of experience I'm talking about.
All right, go ahead.
I'm talking about sort of a complete negation of an experience, that it's not something that you went through and you learned and you thought you had you had a certain impression and it didn't pan out. No, I'm talking about something that you're willing to completely discredit something that you experienced.
Well, let's take Steve's example of predictability then. Let's say a hypothetical experiment where the researcher says, okay, you have these choices in front of you. We'll have 100 trials. You always pick, freely and randomly whatever you want to pick. Now, in the meantime, in a sealed box, he already has all the answers down. And you find out that all the answers that you thought you were picking freely were already written down. Would that be an example of saying, oh, gosh, that's an illusion? Or is it even more beyond that?
No, because I think it involves... this is where it's almost a conundrum, because in order to discredit your own experience, it's an act of free will.
All right.
I don't know.
Okay. John.
Well, I'd like to pick up on what Steve said. I noticed that if you're doing creative work, you can think about things for a while, but all you can really do with conscious thinking is solve problems that you already know how to solve. If you actually need something new, you have to wait for it to come to you spontaneously. I think anyone who's ever done any sort of creative work knows that. Thinking definitely has its limitations, and there are those two things you have to do: think about it, and then wait for some new idea to come up by itself. And as for what Zach was saying about discrediting experience, how about dreams? When you're dreaming, everything that you do in the dream, everything that happens in the dream seems to make perfect sense. But when you wake up, you realize it was all nonsense. So where does that leave? Ordinary life? Might it not also seem to be nonsense from some higher point of view? Somebody once said, "Dreams seem real while they last. Can more be said of life?"
Mm-hmm. So we might wake up from life at some point.
Yeah, that's what that's the object of religious practice, I understand,
Okay.
at least in the East.
Okay, David.
The question is our sense of free will false? Meaning an illusion, meaning it's a false sense that we are living a veiled life, that we cannot see truth. And my answer to that is, who cares?
Mm-hmm.
You know, I mean, well, why is it relevant? In a practical sense, if we are living an illusory life, we will never know about it.
Would it not make a difference to you?
Yeah, it's sort of like the belief in God. The belief in God is only important if it changes behavior. And it's my feeling is that whether God exists or not is irrelevant. It's how we behave as if God existed that's relevant. And whether or not we're making choices of our own free will or because the stars have set our lives in motion, it really doesn't matter, because as we express our free will, we experience our free will.
Okay. Well, we're down to less than 1 minute, so a quick response from Mike, if you want to.
I just wanted to mention, in response to Zeke's question, a good example would be someone who gets a post-hypnotic suggestion to do something at, say, 3 o'clock in the afternoon. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, they perform the action, maybe light a cigarette and put it out or something, and it may seem to them that that's a free act, but they've forgotten that they've been manipulated. That happens to us all the time in our society, and all kinds of influences are shaping us. So you're absolutely right that their influence is a big factor. But the point is that human beings, and I think if we deny this, we really do impoverish our nature. The more conscious we are, the more we can shape these influences.
Great. We'll have to leave it there, and I have to quickly pull out a topic for next time. And the topic is, how has technology changed us as human beings? And that was submitted by Alma Cunningham. So Alma will be a guest next time on Thinking Out Loud. And thank you for joining us. It's been a pleasure. Great discussion. Thank you to all the guests. And till next time.